Wow, 3:15, which is 1:15 my time. So I want you to do something for me and we'll wake ourselves up. Put your hands out like this. And then on the count of 3, you're going to bring them together really hard. 1, 2, 3. Ah. As a Canadian, I just went through a blizzard right before we got to the airport to have me fly here, and about a week before that it was minus 40 still. And just so you know, minus 40 Celsius and minus 40 Fahrenheit are about the only 2 times that Canada and the United States agree on certain things, like the metric system. So a warning, I may use metric in this talk, but I'm not sure yet. So I want to thank some people first before I start talking. Mike and Scott were very kind to ask me to come and speak, and I really appreciate that invitation. And I also want to thank Leslie Fox, who works for the Fur Bearers, and she emailed me out of the blue and said that they had a hotel room that they couldn't use anymore and that it was paid for. So she asked me if I would like the use of the hotel room. So I really, really want to reach out to them and say thank you so much for giving me a bed to sleep in while I'm here, because I see it's raining outside. So now that the thank yous are over, I am in the room with a whole bunch of people whose shoulders I've stood on to try to figure out how I'd proceed in studying beavers over the years, and that'll come up during the talk. So I'm an ecologist, and I have often received phone calls and emails from people asking, how do we keep the benefits of beaver while still reducing conflicts? And my phone rings off the hook. I was just on an interview with Canadian Broadcasting Corporation the other day, and they asked me about beaver conflicts, and I said, oh, my phone rings off the hook. And we have a system at the university where all of our phone messages go immediately to our email. So as I said that, there was a phone call that was coming in south of Calgary asking about how this guy could get beavers onto his property. So I thought it made sense. So I've often wondered about that. How do you balance the ecological benefits with the conflicts that do arise with beavers? And so I've gone on quite a journey to find that answer. I've gone from being an ecologist to an ecologist plumber to an economist apprentice, and I will take you on that walk a wee bit today. So let's see where we go today. As an ecologist, I've really enjoyed just exploring those ecological questions, and you could just put me on snowshoes or in a canoe and chest waders, maybe not chest waders in the canoe, but canoe or chest waders. You can tell I've got some experience behind me not to know wear chest waders in a canoe anymore. But I'd be happy out there all day gathering ecological data, analyzing it statistically, doing mapping and geographic information systems, and looking at all the answers just flow through. That's where I'm happiest. And I've done a fair bit of research looking at how these wonderful animals change systems ecologically, the role that they play on changing landscapes, how they influence the distribution of other species, how they increase water levels, not just on the surface, but below ground. And I had the great fortune of being called once, so like I said, I do get phone calls that are awfully odd. And this one was from a wildlife rescue association in Edmonton who was tasked with the job of cleaning 3 bitumen-contaminated beavers. So bitumen is a very heavy oil product that is very common in Alberta. And they were contaminated with bitumen and rehabilitated at the Wildlife Rescue Association. And then they needed to be released, and they asked if I would study them over time to see how they recovered and responded to not only bitumen contamination, but also being released into a new area. And it was fascinating. I got to see how they changed the vegetation communities and how they changed the actual physical structure of the water body that we put them in, how they survived the winter, and how they acted naturally in a system after a very unnatural act. It was actually quite Olympian of them on how they did it. So I will give you a little video. Oh, I'm stuffing. And there was to be music, but we don't know if it's going to work. So if any of you know the Chariots of Fire theme song, that's what's behind the scenes here. You know, that whole da-da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-dum. This beaver's name is Brownie, and Brownie is doing what beavers do best, digging the bottoms of ponds, making these massively huge structures, lodges and dams, digging channels. And it was really fascinating to just see how dramatically these animals can change a landscape. The pond that we put them in was actually an agricultural dugout. I wasn't able to examine the site of release prior to the release. It was just one of those actions that had to go really, really quickly. And they assured me that it was a really nice wetland that we were putting them into. And I said, okay. So by the time I got down there, I saw that it wasn't really a natural wetland. But those beavers transformed it into this really oddly shaped wetland that had all sort of dendritic channels running out of the sides and changed the vegetation. Within 14 months, that place was unrecognizable, much to the farmers' chagrin, but they fell in love with the beavers anyway. But it also made me know that this ability to engineer landscapes can also be used for other purposes. Before I was a professor, I worked with Parks Canada for almost 20 years as a park warden, and a lot of that time was spent in the backcountry, but I did settle into Elk Island National Park, where I also did my PhD on beaver ecology. And, well, in Elk Island, I saw this road quite often look like this. This is a major boundary fire road that's used for emergency response in the case of wildfire. And the beavers were quite happy to find the very one small culvert that was in that road and turn it into a gigantic dam. When I asked the General Works Department about how much money had they spent trying to repair this road over and over again after these sorts of incidents with beavers, and they said, well, it's over $100,000, which is about 20 cents US. I took a cab from downtown Penn Station, and oh man, I can't wait to see my visa. But it was repeated, and I actually asked the park ecologist at the time if we could try one of these flow devices that I'd heard of. And he said, no, won't work. We just removed the dam. I'd also been doing longitudinal study of population dynamics in the park and noticed that this pond itself had been reoccupied over and over and over again. Every time beavers were removed, there was a reoccupation event. And so this would be a continual problem. So how did things get dealt with? But, well, for the most part, it was dynamite and backhoes, and dynamite, backhoes, dynamite, backhoes. And if you look way at the very top of that image, you might see some little black dots. That's part of the dam that was blown up. There was a ton of dynamite that was put in there, and I was the only one wearing a hard hat. You can see that I'm taking the photo from a vantage point that says common sense. And guess what they found by the next morning? It was more than just back, it was twice the height. So that's how traditional management's done, often. It's efficient, people feel good, they get some overtime. We stayed about 2 or 3 hours after the clock. But it's not very efficient in the long run. And ecologically, did I mention I was an ecologist and not an economist, even though the paper's going to talk about some economic ideas? Ecologically, it's heartbreaking for me, because every time this happens, this is the result. And this was another pond in the park. And this was early May, which in Canada is the start of spring. Hopefully, fingers crossed this year. And I had just been to this pond the day before, admiring it because there were waterfowl that were laying eggs in their nests. There were riparian songbirds. Oh man, the amphibian calls were just to die for. You could even see some egg masses in the pond. I knew that the pond was active and that the young beaver kits hadn't yet come out of the lodge for their very first time. And I drove by the next day and it had been drained. As a practice run to learn how to use dynamite and culverts. It wasn't even a problem pond. Now in Alberta, we have fairly stringent rules on wetland drainage because we've lost almost 70% of our non-boreal wetlands in the province. And so I calculated the area of this pond. It's 2.5 hectares. And in this area of Alberta, that would cost $19,000 per hectare to mitigate. Compensation, apart from the charges that would happen under the Water Act, the Wildlife Act, and various other pieces of legislation, would be over $47,000 of compensation if it hadn't been done by government workers. We do this repeatedly, and my research has shown that these ponds are actually some of the highest ponds, some of the highest biodiversity that we've measured in many of the ponds that don't have beavers. So the beaver ponds are often higher in different invertebrate communities. We have shown that there are certain fish species, not all, but certain fish species that respond quite positively to beaver ponds. Riparian songbirds do very well, small mammal species, and amphibians. And so it always breaks my heart because I think you're targeting something that is absolutely crucial ecologically on the landscape. And then they're back the next day, but everything else is lost. In one of the studies that one of my master's students and I worked on, Nils Anderson, we looked at wood frog dispersal, a very, very common frog in our part of the world. And they disperse, yes, even when there's snow in the early spring. And you'll see all those channels that the beavers dig from the edge of these otherwise isolated, geographically isolated ponds. And the wood frogs use these channels preferentially for dispersal. So much so that in our study we found that they use them 9 times more often than the regular shoreline of those ponds. These are travel corridors. With invertebrates, especially with predaceous invertebrates, we determined that they were hunting hotspots. They are unique habitats that often don't get classified as such in wetland assessment methodologies. Just to show you just how unique these things can be, these are what I call my boreal neurons. For me, they act as increasing connectivity between the aquatic system and the terrestrial system that surrounds them. The perimeters of these ponds can increase by over 1,000% just by beavers digging these channels. They are the first to recover from drought, even extreme drought. And they're just an absolutely, unbelievably complex wetland type. You'll see that every year I do beaver lodge surveys in December with my students, and we classify every year which lodges are active, which are in red, and which lodges are inactive, which are in yellow. And we can do all sorts of different studies looking at the longitudinal effects of beaver populations when beavers are there, when they're not, relative to drought, relative to biodiversity, relative to landscape connectivity. But I'd be naive to think that this doesn't happen. This was a very popular horse trail in the southern extent of the Cooking Lake Blackfoot Provincial Recreation Area, which is just south of Elk Island National Park. And actually, where we were blowing up that dam, it's just right across the fence. And so I had to think about, well, I can complain about them draining these ponds, but I have to think about how am I going to be part of the solution? Well, very fortunate for me, I was in Arnhem in the Netherlands in 2003 during the 3rd Beaver Conference, International Beaver Symposium. And that's where I met Skip Lyle, and I saw his talk on pond leveling devices, and that was in that journal that he held up, Lutra. And I sat there and I thought about alternative methods of protecting these very, very precious water bodies and the animals that live in them. So I let that settle for a few years, trying to figure out how I would actually turn that into a study, which I'm presenting today. And finally, through listening to Skip's talk, looking at his papers, and then Mike Callahan's work and his DVD, and just trying to figure out how I might apply that, I was able to turn an area that looked like that into an area that looked like that. It took a lot of tries. This was a really complicated site. I developed what I called a Mini, because I drive a Mini Cooper, so why not name it after my car? But it was like a mini pond leveler, and this trail had been flooded for up to 10 years. All sorts of people calling their members of parliament, members of the legislative assembly, and threatening to sue the park because they couldn't ride their $40,000 horses down this trail anymore. I'm not kidding, that's what was happening. It was dry for at least 7 years, but that was the end of my study when we would look at these things. Sure, it needed a little tweaking every once in a while, but it was dry and quite usable for that amount of time after the installation as a pond leveler. This was part of a study, a human-beaver conflict study that I set up, and I wanted to look at how effective are these pond leveling devices relative to the types of management that I'd experienced as a park warden. Developed a site-specific cost-benefit analysis of how these pond levelers worked economically versus traditional approaches, and then just a little pilot study with one of my former students on public perceptions. So following the methods that were outlined in Mike Callahan's work and Skip's work and a little bit of just trying it out, losing lots of sleep, worrying about drowning because I'm a terrible swimmer, and finally investing in some proper floats, we were able to install quite a number of these, 13 in the Cooking Lake Blackfoot, another, 13 or 14 in neighboring Beaver County, some in Camrose County, and we were finding really surprising results. So I think we saw a lot of how these devices are put together. This is a little schematic in a paper that I published with Dr. Varghese Manilor, who is an economist and one of our former students, Brenda Zioba, to show how these are put together and how they can work. Because oddly enough, even though pond leveling devices have been around for a very long time, people would say, well, nobody's ever heard of these. Can you give us a schematic of them? And I said, well, have you ever heard of the Clemenson pond leveler that's gone back to the 50s, Skip? When was that? Way back. Yeah. So one of the key things was site mapping, finding out where the problem sites were, ones that we could deal with, ones that we couldn't. And so green meant that we'd dealt with the site, we'd put in pond levelers, red meant that they were next in line, yellow meant that we had to keep an eye on it, and blue were that it was just way too dangerous for us to deal with. There was either a natural gas pipeline running underneath the culvert, which wasn't fun, and I just didn't feel like getting blown up for science. I'm not a physicist. So just to give you an example, some of the sites that we had, some would use culverts, some of the sites involved culverts and beavers plugging culverts, some were underneath bridges that were built to Transportation Alberta standards, so really solid bridges. Did site mapping also in Beaver County, and that was a start, so that managers would also have an idea of where the problem sites were and what they could do to mitigate them, and gave us an idea of the distribution of beavers. You can't do this kind of work with this kind of species, though, without public engagement as well. We work very closely with Beaver County to get the word out with the public, to interact with the public, to have the public on board. They posted our project on their website. We worked quite a lot with the media. They would arrange all sorts of media interviews. We would go to the community itself. Bounty in the County was a big event that would happen in Beaver County, and so we'd set up a table there, and little kids would come, and we'd teach them about beavers and had a model pond leveling device there. We would go to the Camrose Green Space Stewardship talks that are sort of science talks that would happen in the community all through the summer. And the county made YouTube videos of what we were doing and then posted them online as well. And so we did a lot of public outreach, which you have to do if you're going to be working with an animal that is so emotionally charged with some members of the public. On the economic side, we did the cost-benefit analysis, and so we kept track of, as best we could, of all the costs that management had ever put into those sites per year prior to the installation of the pond leveling device. And I can tell you that a lot of agencies do not keep good track of how much it costs to deal with beavers. They just don't even note how many hours they spent. And so we prepped them in advance that that's what we'd be doing, and so they tried to keep track of their costs for traditional methods for those same sites. For the Cooking Lake Blackfoot Provincial Recreation Area, the Alberta Trail Riders Association was one of the biggest sponsors of, and enthusiasts, not biggest sponsors, but enthusiasts for us doing this project because they wanted to ride their horses. So we developed a willingness to pay model to give some valuation to the park trails themselves. And so we were able to have some sort of valuation for the trails, how much people would be willing to pay to use those trails without the presence of beaver flooding. In Beaver County, of course, it's not a recreation area, so instead we used wetland valuation as a metric on the value of those wetlands relative to what would happen if they were just drained and what would normally happen to a landowner or a corporation if they were to drain wetlands for their development. And so we used those metrics. And of course, we kept our budget numbers right down to the penny. How many kilometers we went, how many hours, right to the minute that we spent installing these devices. So we had those 3 metrics. So yeah, just to guide you through this, there's the Cooking Lake Blackfoot project, and then there's the Beaver County project on the bottom. Cost-benefit analysis with the willingness to pay or the wetland valuation on the left, and on the right is just what we call the sensitivity analysis, where that was just dollar for dollar. How much did it cost one versus the other? And if you look at these numbers, if we actually put in what the trails are worth, we are over $2 million saving, and that was just over, I think, about a 3-year period. We followed this money right for 7 years, for as long as we had kept monitoring the pond leveling devices. Without any of the valuation of the trail, however, we're still looking at an $81,000 savings just for installing 13 pond leveling devices into a provincial recreation area that is constantly strapped for funds. They're always getting cut back on funding. Beaver County was terrible at keeping its maintenance costs. They were very good to work with. They were wonderful champions of what we were doing. They're very generous with everything. But it was very hard for them because it was so reactive. I have to go here and unplug that culvert. I have to go there, and by the way, there's a dead deer on the road, and I'm going to have to pick that up on my way by. So they were not as diligent. I think these numbers are very conservative. But even for them, $227,000 savings when we looked at wetland valuation, and only $34,000 savings otherwise. But again, I would say that that is an incredibly conservative number given the really poor data we had on their management costs, because they were much higher because we'd watch them all day just running around all the time trying to deal with beaver issues. And a back costs about $300 an hour, and they were using it every day. So when looking at landowner perceptions, it was a little bit more complicated. The data were a little less robust, but they gave us a hint of what was happening. And I should just mention in this photo, about half the people in the photo are volunteers who just wanted to get involved in the project. They're not my paid research crew. It was like a Tom Sawyer project. Now if I could only get them to paint my fence, but people just were drawn to this. They wanted to try to help and figure this out, and in some cases it turned people's perceptions around. So let's talk about some of that perception relative to the context of the situation. So again, we're in the area of Beaver County that is in the Cooking Lake Moraine, which also holds the Blackfoot Cooking Lake Provincial Recreation Area. And I did a little bit of work with the GIS to figure out where the highest density of beaver lodges were. So I digitized all the beaver lodges in that part of the county. And lo and behold, the highest density of beaver lodges, that big red hot spot there, is also where the majority of the rural residential subdivisions are being built or have been built. The rest is agricultural land, long-standing agricultural land where they would never build a rural residential subdivision because it's too good for farming. People like to live near water, they like to live near wildlife until it misbehaves, and they like to live near forests. Is there anything else you can think of that likes to live near water, might like a tree or two, and influences lots of other wildlife so that they're around a lot too? Our development permits are part of the problem in this whole situation. We issue development permits and say, let's just wait for the problem. We're issuing development permits in beaver habitat and bear habitat and perfectly good deer habitat, and people like it at first until they start planting very expensive trees. And then what happens is that we have these conflicts, and these conflicts can be significant. So what were some of the perceptions that we heard? They varied and were actually quite polarized. And so when we put this paper in for peer review, and we're going to do it again right when I get back, they said, you didn't have enough sample size, it never settled out. I was like, no kidding. Some people would say about the people buying into these rural residential subdivisions, they're city folk, they can't handle the country. Because the country means that if you've got beaver, you deal with them. And then people would also say, if anybody has a problem with wildlife, they should just leave, period. Well, that's easy to say, but these are multi-generational farms. Some of them go back 4 generations. You can't just tell people to leave, especially when they never knew beaver on the landscape 100 years ago because they were wiped out from the fur trade. Our ecological memory, and we're talking about this at our table, our ecological memory is very short. It goes back decades, maybe a century. Beavers go back millennia, as Francis pointed out earlier. So when people talk to me and they have a beaver issue, they'll say beavers aren't supposed to be here. They've never been here before. They're an invasive species. And I'll think, well, maybe we could do some sediment cores and see if they actually were there, or some archaeology. So we do have a lot of things that we have to consider when we work with beavers. One is the ecology, and that's where I love to be out on my snowshoes at -30 and just take a thermos of tea and sit by the side of a pond and figure it all out. But we also need to have economists involved. We need to have psychologists involved, communicators involved, social scientists involved. We have to get political scientists involved. It is a multifaceted issue. It needs a multifaceted answer and solution. We need good writers. Francis's book is fabulous at laying out the history of beavers, but going into very modern thoughts and ideas of it. So that's, I guess, my parting idea, is that these pond levelers are cost effective. They are very functional, but I'll put a caveat on that. I told you that we worked with these for about 7 years or more, and we'd always go through first thing in the spring and last thing in the fall and double check on them, respond to any issues, which there were very, very few. But as soon as we handed them over to the agencies that had us put them in the first place, they started having problems because they never checked on them. They just said these things don't work. And all it would have taken was to just clean out a little bit of a stick here or there before it became a bigger problem. So that's part of the communication that needs to be passed on generationally within organizations as well. So my final question is, how do we go from this to this? And we can, and we have, and we've done it economically. It might take a whole bunch of different tools in the toolbox. A pond leveler is just one tool, but there are many, many tools that we can use in order to allow beavers and humans to coexist in a more complementary way. With that said, I have many, many people to thank. And again, I want to thank the fur bearers for the bed in this hotel. It's a very comfortable bed, by the way. And I want to thank you for your attention. I know it's been a long day. It's been a great day, a room full of people who like beavers. Because every time I say I'm going to a conference and they say, what kind of conference? And I say a beaver conference. And then what do? They laugh at me. I did my master's on grizzly bear habitat modeling, and they're all like, oh, that's so cool. You're going to a bear conference. I'm at a beaver conference, and that's a great thing. So thank you for your attention, and I think we've got a fair bit of time for some questions. Okay.
Hello, Dr. Hood. My name is Stephanie Boyles-Griffin. I'm with the Humane Society of the United States. Really loved your presentation, and I cannot wait to read your paper when it's published.
Oh, it's already published, that one.
Oh, okay. So
I've got another one coming out on
coming
Thursday, but it's not anything to do with economics. I went
Awesome.
back to being an ecologist again.
I did a similar project in Virginia with Skip Lyle.
Yeah, I've
and
read your paper. It's great.
And we ran into the same problem. Once we gave up ownership of the project, then 30 plus devices that we installed at these study sites, they're probably just disintegrating right now because people aren't taking care of them. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts? I don't, honestly. This is a complete mystery for Skip and I on why, after making that investment in the pilot project, it was a successful pilot project. How do we get these agencies that were working so hard to be sort of a mediator between beavers and their objectives, how do we do a better job of getting them to own it and take care of it?
I lose sleep over that one because there were moments when I couldn't go out and check for various reasons. Life happens, and I don't know, because I'd even present it to county council, who are the decision makers on this. I would present to the park, not just the administration, but higher up in parks. I'd be out in the field with some of the park staff helping me, and as soon as we were gone, either the information about where the devices were disappeared, even though I would present annual reports that had maps in them and GPS locations and little carrots that would be, maybe they didn't like carrots, I don't know, that I would drop towards the devices. I would open that one up because this is why I am an ecologist, so I don't have to study human behavior too often, because it just confounds me. It's my confounding variable of life, really. Anybody have any ideas why agencies don't do the follow-up on this after they've invested often tens of thousands of dollars into these studies and seen the economic advantages? If you've got a magic bullet for this, it'd be great. And your paper was fantastic, by the way. Okay. Adrian, yeah.
Thanks so much for that, Glynnis. Just a quick question for you. The savings, the cost savings that you had for Beaver County, how many devices was that?
That was actually 13 as well.
13 as well.
That was over about a 2-year period, though, so it's gone up quite a bit. We tracked it for over 7 years. But the big flaw in that machine is that they didn't keep track of their management costs. So, of course, it looks more, there's more of an equitable expenditure or lower expenditure on their part that shows up in the model. They were spending probably more than the park was to do that. So that's just cost accounting. And I think even within the county they were frustrated because they had told their employees, you have to keep track of this, and it just wasn't happening. But that's being understaffed as well. So it is a lower number, but it doesn't reflect reality. And I even wrote that in the paper, is that these numbers are very, very conservative relative to how much they actually are spending. Because remember that one road in Elk Island? How much was it? Other than 2 cents American. What was it, Canadian? $100,000 just for that one road in one park. There are roads like that throughout the county. There are trails like that throughout the Cooking Lake Blackfoot. So their expenses were not under $100,000, and that's often what was reported. So.
It does seem like a lot of, on the other side of the management side of things, that other costs that aren't accounted for, like the cost of the capital for all that heavy machinery,
yeah,
and the place to store that machinery, the cost of potential damage when you're not vigilant, when your flow device is always vigilant with the exception of some maintenance, but you know, if the road does blow out or whatever, you know, then that's a cost that also should go on that side of the ledger.
The very cost of a new culvert, you don't know how many times, and I must be half tough. I've used more Purell flying here than I did the entire time, because we have now one place that this career of mine has taken me is to Baltimore during an emerging global pandemic. So I probably use more hand sanitizer, just flying here and being here. Not that I'm worried, but my students worry me more with their colds. But than I did the entire time working with beavers in 20 years. But one of the things is I would cut myself on these culverts sometimes, even though I'd be wearing gloves, because the backhoe had ripped half the culvert open. And then you've got a damaged culvert, which is in the tens of thousands of dollars. If you do a double O culvert and you wreck that thing, I mean, I can stand in that. And I know I'm not terribly tall, but I'm not culvert insecure. I'm still tall. That's a lot of money, especially if you've got pavement above it, because then you got to rip out the pavement, and you've got utility lines that often run along culverts. They don't account for those sorts of things, and I saw so many culverts that were crushed almost to the point where water wouldn't flow through them, regardless of a flow device. Yeah, there's a lot of hidden costs that aren't there. Gloves, Purell.
One of the ideas around how to approach the agencies not following through with maintenance is something we're about to approach, and I don't have 5, 10, 20 years to back it up of how well it works, but Beavers Northwest in Washington has a little bit of time in backing it up, is offering maintenance contracts on these things, that the agencies
Brilliant.
are not continually being funded generally for conservation actions, restoration actions, that they're often hiring subcontractors or independent contractors to do all that kind of work, and whether it's grant funded or not. But trying to work that into those projects or relationships, that this will be a maintenance contract, so it will be cared for and maintained in perpetuity, or as long as the materials last. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as a researcher, I have to be able to call when a study's done, because I have to continue on, especially if I've published everything I can out of it and everything else. And even with that, they're about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years after the fact, where as a side project, I call it training. I get my students, my research assistants, to run out and check all the culverts just as training, even though it wasn't associated with that contract. But eventually sabbaticals happen. And I think that that's a good idea. I've also been encouraging people to do this as a sideline, because I'm not going to set up I just don't make a good plumber. I have asked if people could set up these kind of companies that would do this, and some have tried, but a lot of people don't want to pay money for this, and they don't, even though the numbers are out there, they don't realize that they'd actually be saving money, because it's that upfront cost, not budgeted into their general operating costs. But yeah, I wish you well. I hope it goes well. I think that's a brilliant idea, though.
I think with climate change and then the increasing awareness, just education and outreach that's occurring with Beaver Believers and other outreach in general, I think those times probably are changing enough that eventually Beaver Believer chapters or Beaver Coalition or whatever is going to unite us across North America and hopefully Europe as well. Hopefully that will become a viable model for for-profit work, but until it does, our grant funding and cost sharing hopefully can cover that maintenance cost. But that's what we're moving towards, and I really appreciate you talking and presenting these cost analysis, cost-benefit analysis, in order for us to move forward and present it even better to the municipalities and others. So
Well,
thank you.
Yeah, given my parks background and having worked with Alberta Parks so much when I was doing my research, there's one thing that my former chief warden and I used to talk about, is that when we hire general works staff, they do the best that they can, but they often come from an ag background, an agricultural background, where you just dig a ditch, you do these things, and they don't necessarily have ecological training. It would be really nice if agencies would have little mini ecology workshops, especially ones that are tasked with ecological conservation, to have little ecological workshops for their staff internally, so that people, those guys felt terrible about draining that wetland, especially after we read the Canada National Parks Act sections that we could easily apply to the charges. But they felt terrible about that once we explained it ecologically, but they didn't have a clue, and it's not their fault. They're hired by Parks Canada, but to do specific tasks without the need for any ecological knowledge. And I think anybody working within these systems that are inherently developed to, as conservation as a key goal, have internal conservation and ecology training sessions within, so that the person driving the backhoe thinks twice about, driving overland during ground bird nesting season or something like that. So I think that there's a give and take on either side. Yeah. We're good?
Thank you so much for this.